The platform stretched endlessly before them, a concrete artery pulsing with human misery. Auschwitz-Birkenau, May 1944. The air hung thick with the scent of fear and exhaust fumes as the cattle train shuddered to a halt. Its doors slid open with a metallic groan, releasing a wave of humanity, families clutching each other, children crying, the elderly struggling to stand after days without water or proper sanitation. SS officers shouted orders in German, their voices sharp as whips, cutting through the chaos. Among the sea of faces, 13-year-old Eva Moses clutched her twin sister Miriam's hand. Their mother had told them to stay together, no matter what happened. The girls wore identical dresses, their dark hair matted with sweat and grime. As they were herded off the train, Eva noticed a man standing apart from the other officers. He was immaculately dressed in a tailored SS uniform, his white gloves pristine against the darkness of the fabric. His eyes scanned the crowd with clinical detachment, occasionally pausing to examine a face, a pair of twins. The selection process began with terrifying efficiency. With a casual wave of his hand left or right, Josef Mengele decided who would live and who would die. The elderly, the sick, mothers with young children were directed to the left, toward the gas chambers. The able-bodied, those who could work, were sent to the right. When Mengele's gaze fell upon Eva and Miriam, his expression changed. A flicker of something almost like excitement crossed his features. He approached them, his boots clicking on the concrete. "Zwillinge?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. "Twins." Eva nodded, terrified. Mengele smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of the lips that never reached his eyes. He made a note on his clipboard and directed them to a separate line. As they walked away, Eva risked a glance back and saw her mother and father being herded toward the left. She wanted to scream, to run to them, but Miriam's grip on her hand tightened. Mengele's eyes followed them, cold and calculating. In that moment, Eva understood that being selected as a twin was both a curse and a twisted form of salvation. They had been spared immediate death, but something far more terrifying awaited them in the laboratory of the Angel of Death. The twins were led to a special barracks, crammed with other pairs, boys and girls of various ages, all marked for Mengele's experiments. The air inside was thick with whispered fears and stifled sobs. That night, as Eva lay on the thin straw mattress, she couldn't shake the image of Mengele's eyes, pale blue, almost translucent, devoid of any human warmth. They were the eyes of a scientist examining specimen, not a human being looking at children. Those eyes would haunt her dreams for decades to come, a constant reminder of the man who would subject her and her sister to unimaginable horrors in the name of pseudoscience and racial purity. The Laboratory of Horrors, Auschwitz-Birkenau, June 1944. The twins' barracks stood separate from the main prison blocks, a macabre showcase of Mengele's particular obsession. Each morning began with the same ritual, the appearance of the SS doctor with his clipboard and his chillingly precise demeanor. The children learned to recognize the sound of his polished boots approaching on the gravel path, a sound that would freeze their blood and silence their whispers. Eva and Miriam had been at Auschwitz for 3 weeks when they were first summoned for examination. The journey through the camp was a study in contrasts: the orderly rows of buildings, the meticulously kept gardens tended by prisoners, all juxtaposed against the skeletal figures working under the watchful eyes of SS guards, the ever-present smell of burning flesh from the crematoria. The twins were led to a building that looked like any other hospital from the outside, but inside, it housed horrors that defied imagination. Room 13 was Mengele's private laboratory. The walls were lined with shelves holding glass jars containing preserved organs, body parts, and malformed fetuses. Medical instruments gleamed under sterile lighting. In the center of the room stood examination tables, leather restraints dangling ominously. Eva felt Miriam's hand tremble in hers as Mengele entered, followed by his assistant, a Hungarian Jewish doctor named Miklos Niesli, who had been forced to assist in the experiments. "Today we begin your proper examination," Mengele announced in his fluent, accented German. He removed his white gloves with deliberate care, revealing pale, slender fingers. "You will contribute to important scientific research." The examinations were exhaustive and humiliating. Every part of their bodies was measured, photographed, and compared. Blood was drawn in large quantities, leaving the girls weak and dizzy. They were subjected to painful injections whose contents were never explained. Throughout it all, Mengele observed with intense interest, his pale blue eyes taking in every detail, every reaction. He seemed particularly fascinated by any differences between the twins, no matter how minute. One afternoon in July, the twins were taken to a different part of the laboratory where other children waited. Some had bandages covering their eyes or limbs. Others moved with visible difficulty, their bodies bearing the marks of previous experiments. Mengele gathered them around as if addressing a class. "You are special," he told them, his voice carrying a strange enthusiasm. "Nature has provided us with perfect experimental subjects. Through you, we will unlock the secrets of heredity, of racial purity, of what makes us superior." The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical experiments. Mengele would sometimes appear unexpectedly in the twins' barracks, bringing candy or new clothes. He would play with the children, pat their heads, and speak kindly to them. These moments of apparent kindness were more terrifying than his cruelty, because they demonstrated his complete detachment from humanity. He could be charming one moment and ordering horrific experiments the next, all without any apparent emotional conflict. One evening, as they huddled together for warmth, Eva noticed something different in the camp atmosphere. The air raids were becoming more frequent, and the SS officers seemed increasingly agitated. Rumors began circulating among the prisoners the Russians were advancing. The war was coming to an end. For the first time in months, Eva allowed herself to hope that they might survive this nightmare. But even as she clung to this hope, she knew that Mengele would never allow his precious research subjects to fall into enemy hands. If liberation came, it would likely come too late for them. As autumn deepened and the first snow began to fall, Mengele's experiments took on a new urgency. He seemed desperate to complete his work, to gather as much data as possible before the inevitable collapse of the Third Reich. The twins were subjected to longer, more painful sessions. Some simply disappeared overnight, their fates unknown. Through it all, those pale blue eyes continued to observe, to document, to analyze the eyes of a man who had surrendered his humanity completely to the pursuit of a twisted scientific ideal. The collapse and the escape. January 1945. Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Russian artillery thundered in the distance, a growing drumbeat of impending doom for the Third Reich. The camp, once a symbol of Nazi efficiency and industrialized murder, was descending into chaos. The air, thick with the smell of burning documents and the ever-present odor of death, now carried the sharp tang of panic. SS officers, their faces etched with fear, barked orders with a new, frantic urgency. The final solution was being hastily dismantled. Eva and Miriam, huddled in their barrack, felt the tremors of the distant explosions through the thin wooden floor. The experiments had stopped abruptly days ago. Mengele had vanished. For the twins, this absence was more terrifying than his presence. What did it mean? Were they to be killed, left to starve? The uncertainty gnawed at them, a fresh horror in a life already defined by suffering. They could hear the SS guards discussing the evacuation, a word that sent a chill through the remaining prisoners. They knew it meant a death march. On January 18th, the order came. The camp was to be evacuated. All prisoners capable of walking were to be marched westward, away from the advancing Red Army. The twins, weakened by months of torture, were barely able to stand, but the alternative was to be left behind for the liberators, a fate the SS deemed worse. As they were herded out of the gates, Eva looked back at the sprawling complex of death, the barbed wire, the guard towers. A part of her wanted to stay, to see the camp fall, but survival instinct, honed to a razor's edge over the past year, propelled her forward into the snow-covered unknown. Meanwhile, 50 miles to the west, in the city of Gleiwitz, another drama was unfolding. Josef Mengele, having abandoned his research and his subjects, was making his own escape. He had changed out of his SS uniform, donning the clothes of a Wehrmacht officer. His meticulous nature served him well. His false papers were flawless, identifying him as Fritz Hallmann, a simple soldier. He carried with him a briefcase not of medical instruments, but of research data and personal valuables. The eyes that had so coldly observed the suffering at Auschwitz now darted nervously, scanning the chaotic crowds for any threat. Mengele's journey was a stark contrast to the death march he had condemned his subjects to. He traveled by train and car, moving through the disintegrating infrastructure of the Third Reich. He witnessed the collapse of the regime he had served with such fanatic devotion. Cities were in ruin, refugees clogged the roads, and the once feared Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self. Yet through it all, he moved with a single-minded purpose: to evade capture and disappear. He was no longer the angel of death, the master of Auschwitz. He was just another man trying to survive the fall. Back on the march, Eva and Miriam's strength was failing. Miriam, her kidneys permanently damaged by Mengele's injections, was fading fast. One afternoon, she collapsed, unable to go on. Eva, refusing to leave her sister, dropped to her knees in the snow, wrapping her arms around Miriam's frail body. She expected the bullet at any moment, but it never came. An older woman, also a prisoner, saw them and shared a piece of bread, giving them the strength to continue. In that moment of shared humanity, Eva found a reason to keep fighting, not just for herself but for Miriam. After weeks of unimaginable hardship, the twins arrived at the Ravensbrück concentration camp in northern Germany. It was another place of death, but the atmosphere was different. The end was palpable. The guards seemed listless, the administration in disarray. They remained there for only a few weeks before being transferred again, this time to Mauthausen in Austria. By the time they arrived, they were near death, weighing little more than 35 kilograms each. On May 5, 1945, the American Army liberated Mauthausen. Eva and Miriam, lying on a pile of straw in a barracks filled with the dying and the dead, were too weak to comprehend what was happening. They saw soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms entering the camp, their faces showing shock and revulsion at the sights before them. One soldier approached them, offering a piece of chocolate. It was the first act of kindness from a free person they had experienced in nearly a year. As they savored the sweetness, Eva looked at Miriam and knew, with a certainty that defied their physical condition, that they had survived. They were free. But freedom was a complex and bitter reality. They were alive, but they were alone. Their parents and two older sisters had perished in the gas chambers. They had no home to return to, no family to welcome them. Their bodies were scarred, their minds traumatized. And somewhere out there, the man who had done this to them, the man with the cold, analytical eyes, was also free. The thought was a poison in their moment of liberation. In the chaos of post-war Germany, Josef Mengele was indeed free. Using his false identity, he had managed to avoid the initial dragnets that captured many high-ranking Nazis. He worked as a farmhand in Bavaria, living under the radar, his true identity a secret he guarded with his life. He watched as the Nuremberg trials began, as the world learned the full extent of the horrors of the Holocaust. He heard the testimony of survivors, the evidence of his own crimes. Yet he felt no remorse, only a sense of self-preservation. He was a scientist who had done his duty, he told himself. His research had been for the greater good of the Reich. In 1949, with the help of a network of former SS officers and Nazi sympathizers, Mengele made his move. Using false papers obtained through the Ratline organization Odessa, he boarded a ship in Genoa, Italy, bound for Argentina. He traveled under the name Helmut Greger, another identity crafted to perfection. As the ship sailed away from Europe, Mengele stood on the deck, watching the coastline disappear. He had escaped the continent of his crimes. He was a ghost, free to begin a new life in a new world, while his victims, like Eva and Miriam, were left to piece together the shattered remnants of their own. The irony was as vast as the ocean before him. The angel of death had sailed away on a tide of impunity. Life in the shadows. Buenos Aires, Argentina, 1951. The city pulsed with a vibrant, chaotic energy, a world away from the ruins of post-war Europe. In the bustling port district, among the throngs of immigrants seeking a new start, a man named Helmut Greger established himself as a successful businessman. He rented a comfortable apartment, joined a local social club, and even began a romantic relationship. To his neighbors and acquaintances, he was polite, reserved, and intensely private, a typical German expatriate trying to build a new life. But behind the facade of Helmut Greger lurked Josef Mengele, the angel of death, now a ghost enjoying an unexpected freedom. The transition from concentration camp doctor to South American businessman was seamless for Mengele, thanks to the sophisticated network of Odessa, organization of former SS members. This clandestine group had helped him and hundreds of other high-ranking Nazis escape Europe, providing false identities, travel documents, and contacts in their new homelands. In Argentina, under the sympathetic regime of Juan Perón, Mengele found a safe haven. The country was a magnet for Nazi fugitives, a place where their pasts could be buried and their ideologies could quietly fester. Mengele's initial years in Buenos Aires were marked by a cautious optimism. He worked as a carpenter, using skills he had developed during his time on the run. The work was mundane, a far cry from the god-like power he had wielded at Auschwitz, but it provided a cover and a modest income. He was meticulous, avoiding any behavior that might attract attention. He rarely spoke of his past, deflecting questions with vague references to the war and its aftermath. But at night, alone in his apartment, he would sometimes take out his most prized possession, a small, locked briefcase containing his Auschwitz research notes. He would pore over the charts, the measurements, the data on twins. In these quiet moments, the mask of Helmut Greger would slip, revealing the cold, obsessive scientist who still believed in the value of his work. Meanwhile, in Romania, Eva and Miriam Moses were also trying to rebuild their lives. Liberated from Mauthausen at the age of 10, they had spent years in refugee camps, their physical and emotional wounds healing slowly. In 1950, they were finally granted permission to emigrate to Israel, the Jewish Jewish homeland. The journey was a powerful symbol of their survival, a return to the land their ancestors had dreamed of. But the transition was far from easy. As the twins navigated their adolescence in Israel, Mengele's life in Argentina was taking a turn for the better. Through his Nazi contacts, he met Wolfgang Gerhardt, another German immigrant with a fascist past. Gerhardt owned a successful manufacturing company and was deeply involved in the local Nazi community. He saw in Mengele not just a fellow fugitive, but a kindred spirit. He offered him a job as manager of his farm machinery company, Fadrosa. The position was a perfect cover for Mengele. It provided him with a legitimate income, a reason to travel, and a veneer of respectability. He proved to be a capable and ruthless businessman, applying the same cold efficiency he had used in the camps to the world of commerce. He moved out of his small apartment and into a larger house in a more upscale neighborhood. He began to socialize with other wealthy Germans and Argentines, attending parties and cultural events. He was careful, always maintaining the persona of Helmut Gregor, but the longer he remained at liberty, the more confident he became. In 1954, Mengele made a bold decision. He traveled back to Europe to visit his family in Günzburg, Germany. It was an incredibly risky move, but his desire to see his aging parents and his son, Rolf, whom he had not seen since the boy was an infant, overcame his caution. Using a false passport in the name of Josef Mengele, he traveled to Switzerland and then crossed the border into Germany. The reunion was emotional and surreal. Mengele's father, Karl, a wealthy industrialist, had never fully approved of his son's rabid Nazism, but family loyalty ran deep. He welcomed his son back, providing him with money and support. Mengele spent several weeks in Günzburg, living in a guest house under his assumed identity. He met with Rolf, now a teenager, and tried to establish a relationship with him, though he could never reveal the truth about who he was or what he had done. He also met with his old friend and mentor, Professor von Verschuer, who had once been his superior at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. The meeting was brief and tense. Von Verschuer, now trying to distance himself from his Nazi past, was nervous about being seen with Mengele. They discussed their research in vague terms, but the unspoken truth of Auschwitz hung between them. This trip to Germany was a turning point for Mengele. It proved that he could move through Europe, even the heart of the former Reich, without being captured. It also reinforced his sense of invincibility. He returned to Argentina more confident than ever, ready to live more openly. In 1956, with financial help from his family, Mengele took the biggest step yet in his new life. He bought a 50-acre property in the town of Altagracia, a resort area in the Argentine province of Cordoba. The property included a large house, swimming pool, and extensive grounds. He moved there with his new wife, Martha, the widow of his younger brother, Karl Jr., who had been killed in action during the war. In a bizarre twist of fate, Mengele had married his sister-in-law, and she had joined him in Argentina with her son, Karl Heinz. Life in Alta Gracia was idyllic, a perverse parody of a normal existence. Mengele spent his days managing his property, reading scientific journals, and corresponding with his family in Germany. He and Martha entertained guests, held barbecues, and enjoyed the leisurely pace of life in the Argentine countryside. To the outside world, he was a successful German businessman, enjoying a well-deserved retirement. But the man with the house, the wife, and the stepson was the same man who had sent thousands of children to the gas chambers, who had conducted unspeakable experiments on twins without a flicker of remorse. The contrast was monstrous. While Mengele basked in the South American sun, the hunt for Nazi war criminals was intensifying around the world. In Israel, a new organization, the Mossad, was being formed with a mandate to track down those who had perpetrated the Holocaust. In Vienna, a Holocaust survivor named Simon Wiesenthal was dedicating his life to hunting Nazis, operating from a small office with a team of dedicated researchers. And in the United States, the newly formed Office of Special Investigations was beginning to focus on Nazi war criminals who had immigrated to America. Eva and Miriam, now young women, were also beginning to confront their past. They had left the children's home and were trying to build independent lives. Eva got married and had children, while Miriam struggled with her ongoing health problems. But the shadow of Mengele loomed large over them. They followed the news reports of Nazi trials, like the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, with intense interest. Eichmann's capture by the Mossad in Argentina gave them hope. If they could find Eichmann, surely they could find Mengele. The Eichmann trial was a watershed moment. For the first time, the world heard detailed, first-hand testimony about the Holocaust from survivors. The trial brought the horrors of the camps into living rooms around the globe. It also sent a wave of panic panic through the Nazi community in Argentina. Mengele and his friends went into hiding, moving from safe house to safe house. For a time, it seemed that the net was closing in, but Mengele was lucky. While the Mossad had focused its resources on capturing Eichmann, they had not prioritized Mengele, considering him less significant. This was a grave miscalculation. As the Eichmann trial concluded and the international furor died down, Mengele emerged from hiding. However, the political climate in Argentina was changing. In 1962, President Arturo Frondizi was overthrown in a military coup, and the new government was less sympathetic to former Nazis. Mengele knew it was time to move again. With the help of his network, he fled to Paraguay, establishing himself in the border town of Hohenau, near the Brazilian frontier. He obtained Paraguayan citizenship under his own name in 1959, a stunning act of audacity made possible by bribes to high-ranking officials. In Paraguay, under the protection of the authoritarian regime of Alfredo Stroessner, another Nazi sympathizer, Mengele felt safe once more. He moved into a modest house, lived frugally, and avoided drawing attention to himself. The angel of death had found yet another refuge, disappearing deeper into the shadows of South America, always one step ahead of justice. The Hunter and the Hunted. Vienna, Austria, 1960. A modest office, its walls lined with filing cabinets, photographs, and maps. Simon Wiesenthal, a man whose face bears the deep lines of a survivor, hunched over a desk littered with documents. He is surrounded by ghosts. For 15 years, he has dedicated his life to hunting Nazis, driven by a promise he made to himself while lying in a pile of corpses at Mauthausen concentration camp. He would not let the world forget. His most elusive, most wanted quarry is Josef Mengele. The name is written on a whiteboard in red ink, circled multiple times. Wiesenthal's quest for Mengele is not just a professional pursuit, it is personal. He has heard the testimonies of survivors, read the accounts of the experiments, seen the photographs of the twins. He knows that Mengele represents the absolute depths of Nazi depravity, a man who used the veneer of science to justify unspeakable cruelty. And he knows that Mengele is still out there, living freely, while his victims continue to suffer. The Eichmann capture in 1960 was a major breakthrough, but it also complicated the hunt for Mengele. The global publicity made other Nazis more cautious, and the Argentine government, embarrassed by the Israeli operation on its soil, was less cooperative. Wiesenthal and his team had to rely on a network of informants, whispers, and fragments of information. They followed leads that went nowhere, chased false sightings, and dealt with the frustration of knowing their target was always one step ahead. One of the most promising leads came in 1963. A former SS officer, now living in West Germany, contacted Wiesenthal with information about Mengele's whereabouts. He claimed that Mengele was living in Paraguay under the protection of the Stroessner regime. The informant provided details about Mengele's appearance, his routines, and even the make of his car. It was the most concrete information Wiesenthal had received in years. He passed the information to Israeli authorities and to the West German government, which had issued a warrant for Mengele's arrest in 1959, but the response was frustratingly slow. The Paraguayan government stonewalled all requests, denying that Mengele was in the country. The hunt was stalled by bureaucracy and political expediency. Wiesenthal was furious. He knew that with each passing day, the trail was growing colder. Meanwhile, in Israel, Eva and Miriam Moses were living in a state of limbo. They had seen the Eichmann trial on television, listened to the testimony of survivors who described the very camp where they had been imprisoned. The trial had a profound impact on them. It validated their suffering, gave a voice to their trauma, and offered a glimmer of hope that justice might be possible. But Mengele was still at large. In 1962, Eva gave birth to her first child, a son. The joy of motherhood was mixed with a profound sense of fear and vulnerability. She would hold her baby in her arms and think of the children Mengele had murdered, the twins he had experimented on. The thought that their tormentor was living freely, perhaps even starting a new family of his own, was unbearable. She decided to break her silence. Eva began speaking to school groups about her experiences. At first, it was incredibly difficult. The memories were still raw, the pain still fresh, but she found a sense of purpose in sharing her story. She wanted the world to know what had happened at Auschwitz, what had been done to her and Miriam and thousands of other children. She also wanted to keep the pressure on, to ensure that the hunt for Mengele would not be forgotten. Her public testimony attracted media attention. She was interviewed by newspapers newspapers, appeared on television, and eventually co-wrote a book about her experiences, surviving the Angel of Death. Through it all, she never lost sight of her ultimate goal, to see Mengele brought to justice. She maintained contact with Wiesenthal's office, providing any information she could, and became a public face for the victims of his crimes. Back in Paraguay, Mengele was aware of the hunt. He received regular updates from his network of supporters, who monitored press reports and official inquiries. He was a hunted man, but he was also a patient and cunning one. He had learned to live with paranoia, to trust no one completely, and to be ready to flee at a moment's notice. He changed his appearance, grew a beard, and moved to a more remote location. He was a ghost in his own life, a man without a true identity. In 1971, the hunt took a dramatic turn. A Brazilian journalist named Ricardo Bauer, working for the magazine Veja, received a tip from a source in the Nazi underground. The source claimed that Mengele was not in Paraguay, as most believe, but in Brazil, living in the coastal town of Embu, near Sao Paulo, under the name Wolfgang Gerhardt, the same name as his old friend and business associate from Argentina. Bauer began an investigation, discreetly at first. He rented a house near the one where Mengele was supposedly living and started watching. He saw a man who matched the description, the same height, the same build, the same distinctive walk. He took photographs from a distance. The man was reclusive, rarely leaving his house, but Bauer was convinced he had found his target. But the Brazilian police, when they finally raided the house in Embu, found it empty. Mengele had been tipped off and had vanished once again. It was a devastating blow to all who had worked so hard to find him. Wiesenthal was exhausted and demoralized. Eva felt a profound sense of despair. It seemed that Mengele was untouchable, protected by a combination of luck, cunning, and a network of sympathizers who would go to any lengths to shield him. The years passed, and the hunt for Mengele became a cold case. New generations grew up with no memory of the Holocaust. The world moved on, but for a small group of dedicated hunters, Wiesenthal, his team, the survivors like Eva, the search never ended. They continued to collect information, to follow leads, to keep the flame of justice alive, even as it seemed to flicker and dim. In 1978, a new development gave them hope. The American television network NBC produced a miniseries called Holocaust, which brought the story of the genocide to a massive audience in a way that history books never could. The series was a global phenomenon, and it reignited interest in the pursuit of Nazi war criminals. Public pressure mounted on governments to take action. Around the same time, a team of American and German investigators received a tip from a most unexpected source. The son of a friend of Mengele's, the son, who had no sympathy for Nazis, provided them with a cache of letters that Mengele had written to his family over the years. The letters were a goldmine of information, containing clues about his location, his state of mind, and his network of supporters. Armed with this new evidence, the investigators launched a fresh operation. They tracked down Mengele's associates in Brazil, interviewed former neighbors, and pieced together his movements. They discovered that after the Veja article in 1971, he had fled Embu and moved to a small, isolated farm in the interior of Sao Paulo state, owned by a Hungarian couple named Jasler, who were Nazi sympathizers. By 1979, they had pinpointed his location. They knew where he was living, what he looked like now, and what his daily routine was. They were preparing to move in for the capture. It seemed that after 34 years on the run, the long arm of justice had finally reached Josef Mengele. But fate, in a final, cruel twist, was about to intervene. On February 7, 1979, Mengele went for a swim at a beach near the Brazilian resort town of Bertioga. He was 67 years old, but still a strong swimmer. Witnesses later reported that he seemed to be in good spirits, enjoying the sun and the surf. Suddenly, he suffered a massive stroke. He collapsed in the water and drowned before anyone could help him. The Angel of Death, who had survived the fall of the Third Reich, escaped from Allied custody and evaded capture for over 3 decades, died a quiet, undramatic death far from the scene of his crimes. He was buried in a local cemetery under the name Wolfgang Gerhardt. The news of his death did not become public for another 6 years. In 1985, following a new wave of investigations, a team of forensic experts exhumed the body from the grave in Embu. Using dental records and other evidence, they confirmed what many had long suspected. Josef Mengele was finally dead. Echoes of the abyss. The confirmation in 1985 was not an ending, but a rupture. For decades, the hunt for Josef Mengele had been a fixed star in the constellation of post-war justice, a distant, often invisible point of focus that nonetheless gave purpose and direction to a handful of determined souls. With the forensic confirmation from the grave in Embu, taboo, that star vanished. The universe of justice suddenly felt darker, more chaotic, and profoundly unfair. In her home in Terre Haute, Indiana, Eva Moses Core sat before a television camera, her face a mask of composure that barely contained the storm within. For years, she had spoken of Mengele in the present tense, a living, breathing entity to be pursued. Now, she had to confront the past tense. "He is dead," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "He died in freedom. He was never held accountable. He never had to face us." The cameras rolled, capturing not a moment of triumph, but a profound and public grief. The man who had defined her life, who had been her childhood monster, her adult obsession, was gone, and with him, the possibility of a trial, of testimony, of a verdict. He had stolen that from her, too. The news reverberated through the small community of Nazi hunters. Simon Wiesenthal, now in his late 70s, issued a statement from his Vienna office. It was not a statement of victory, but of resignation. "Justice has not been done," he declared. "Mengele has escaped judgment by man. He will now face a higher judgment." But for those who had dedicated their lives to a earthly justice, this was cold comfort. The meticulous files, the countless hours of investigation, the dangerous journeys, the international diplomacy, it had all led not to a courtroom in Jerusalem or Frankfurt, but to a death certificate from a Brazilian town clerk. The anticlimax was staggering. In Germany, the reaction was one of national shame mingled with a strange sense of relief. The West German government had been heavily criticized for its lackluster efforts to capture Mengele, especially in the early post-war years when he was likely easier to find. Now the problem had solved itself. The uncomfortable questions about how a mass murderer could have lived in peace for so long, with the tacit knowledge of so many, could be quietly shelved. A formal investigation was launched, not into Mengele's crimes, but into the failure of the German authorities to apprehend him. It was a classic case of investigating the investigators, a bureaucratic exercise in closing a door that should never have been opened. But for the survivors, the story was not over. Mengele's death did not erase their memories, nor did it heal their bodies. Miriam Moses, whose kidneys had been permanently damaged by the mysterious injections administered in Auschwitz, continued to suffer. Her health, always fragile, deteriorated throughout the 1980s. Eva watched helplessly as her sister, the other half of her soul, the one person who truly understood what they had endured, grew weaker. The bond that had saved them in the camp was now a source of profound pain as Eva faced the possibility of losing her. In 1987, Miriam's kidneys failed completely. She was put on dialysis, a grueling process that sapped what little strength she had left. Eva, ever the fighter, began a desperate search for a donor. She was not a match. Neither was her husband nor her children. It seemed that Mengele, even from the grave, was still trying to finish what he had started. The poison he had injected into Miriam decades ago was finally claiming its victim. On June 1, 1993, Miriam Moses died in an Israeli hospital. She was 59 years old. Her death certificate listed the cause as kidney failure, but Eva knew the truth. Miriam was a victim of the Holocaust, a casualty of Josef Mengele's twisted science. Her death was the final, fatal echo of the experiments in Room 13. At her sister's funeral, Eva made a vow. She would not let hatred consume her. She would not let Mengele win. She would transform her pain into something else, something that could help others. This transformation began with a radical act of forgiveness. In 1995, Eva returned to Auschwitz for the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the camp. It was a journey back into the heart of her trauma. She stood on the selection platform where she had first seen Mengele, his pale blue eyes scanning the crowd. She walked through the ruins of the barracks where she and Miriam had been held. She visited the site of the crematoria where their parents had been murdered. And then she did something that shocked the world. She issued a declaration of forgiveness, not to the Nazis, but for herself. "I, Eva Moses Core, a twin survivor of Mengele's experiments at Auschwitz, hereby give amnesty to all Nazis who participated in the Holocaust," she read. "I forgive them because I believe forgiveness is an act of self-healing, self-liberation, and self-empowerment." It was a controversial stance, criticized by many survivors who felt that forgiveness was an insult to the dead. But for Eva, it was a necessary step in reclaiming her life from the man who had tried to destroy it. She was no longer Mengele's victim. She was Eva Moses Core, a survivor, a thriver, a force for good in the world. She channeled this new energy into creating the CANDLES Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Terre Haute. The museum's mission was to educate people about the Holocaust, with a special focus on Mengele's twins. It was a place of memory, but also of hope. Eva wanted to ensure that the world would never forget what had happened, but she also wanted to show that it was possible to overcome even the most unimaginable evil. The museum became Eva's life's work. She gave tours, spoke to school groups, and corresponded with other survivors and twin victims from around the world. She became a global advocate for Holocaust education and for the power of forgiveness. She even met with former Nazi Dr. Hans Munch, who had worked at Auschwitz but had not been directly involved in the killings. Their meeting was a powerful symbol of reconciliation, a testament to the possibility of dialogue across the deepest divides. In 2009, Eva faced Mengele one last time. She was asked to testify in the trial of John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian-American who had been a guard at the Sobibor extermination camp. Demjanjuk was not Mengele, but his trial was a reminder that the search for justice, however imperfect, continued. Eva took the stand in Munich, her presence a living rebuke to the idea that the past could be buried. She spoke of her experiences, of her sister's death, of her decision to forgive. She spoke not with hatred, but with a quiet authority that commanded the courtroom. She was no longer a frightened child on the platform at Auschwitz. She was a woman who had faced her demons and emerged stronger. The legacy of Josef Mengele is a complex and troubling one. On one hand, he is a symbol of the absolute depths of human evil, a man who perverted science and medicine in the service of a racist ideology. His crimes are a stark reminder of what can happen when power is unchecked and when the value of human life is subordinated to a twisted ideal. On the other hand, his escape and his death without facing justice are a testament to the failures of the post-war world. They reveal the complicity of governments, the effectiveness of networks of support for war criminals, and the limits of international justice. Mengele did not act alone. He was aided and abetted by a vast network of people who helped him escape, who gave him shelter, who protected him, and who never questioned his right to live in peace. His freedom was a collective failure, but perhaps the most powerful legacy of Mengele is the one he never intended: the resilience of his victims. Eva Moses Kor and others like her have dedicated their lives to ensuring that the world remembers not just the evil that was done, but the strength of those who survived. They have turned their trauma into a force for education, for reconciliation, and for healing. They have shown that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure. The eyes of Josef Mengele, so cold and analytical in the photographs from Auschwitz, no longer hold any power. They have been replaced by the eyes of the survivor, eyes that have seen the worst of humanity but still choose to see the best, eyes that have stared into the abyss and have refused to let the abyss stare back. The angel of death is gone, but the light of his victims continues to shine, a beacon of hope in a world still grappling with the shadows of the past. Section Conclusion Epilogue. The unanswered question. The story of Josef Mengele does not conclude with a neat, satisfying resolution. It frays at the edges, dissolving into the murky waters of historical ambiguity and moral compromise. It leaves us not with a sense of closure, but with a single, haunting question that reverberates through the decades. What does justice look like when the perpetrator is beyond its reach? We are left with the image of a man dying peacefully on a Brazilian beach, while one of his victims succumbed decades later to the lingering effects of his science. This stark, unbearable contrast is the final, defining mark of his legacy. It is a testament to the fact that evil does not always receive its due punishment in this world. The scales of history are not always balanced, and yet to focus solely on Mengele's escape is to grant him one final, posthumous victory. It is to allow his story to be one of triumph rather than tragedy. The true legacy is not found in his comfortable life in South America, but in the resilience of those he sought to destroy. It is found in the voice of Eva Moses Kor, choosing forgiveness over hatred, in her creation of a museum dedicated to memory and education. It is found in the tireless work of Simon Wiesenthal, who refused to let the world forget, even when the world wanted to move on. The hunt for Mengele, though it ended at a grave in Embu, was never just about one man. It was about the principle that some crimes are so terrible they transcend time and borders. It was about a promise to the dead and a duty to the living. The failure to capture him is a historical fact, a stain on the conscience of the post-war world. But the effort to do so, the unwavering commitment to the idea of justice, is a testament to the enduring power of the human conscience. Mengele's story is a dark mirror held up to humanity. It reflects our capacity for unspeakable cruelty, our willingness to look away in the face of atrocity, and our disturbing ability to grant sanctuary to monsters. But it also reflects our capacity for incredible resilience, our unyielding search for truth, and our persistent hope for a more just world. The man is gone, but the struggle between these two opposing forces, the darkness and the light, continues. The angel of death escaped the hangman's noose and the judge's gavel. He lived and died inside a free man. But in the end, what did his freedom gain him? A life lived under a false name, in the shadows, haunted by the knowledge of his own deeds. He is remembered not as a brilliant scientist or a war hero, but as a monster, a cautionary tale told in textbooks and documentaries. His name is synonymous with evil. In the court of history, his verdict has been sealed, and it is one of eternal infamy. The ultimate irony, perhaps, is that in his desperate attempt to create a legacy of racial superiority and scientific achievement, Josef Mengele achieved the opposite. He became a symbol of the ultimate failure of that ideology. He is a reminder of the grotesque perversions that occur when science is divorced from ethics and when power is divorced from humanity. His research was worthless, his theories debunked. All that remains is the suffering he caused and the lessons we must learn from. So we are left with the echo of a child's scream in a laboratory at Auschwitz, the echo of a survivor's testimony in a courtroom decades later, the echo of a question that has no easy answer. The story of Josef Mengele is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a challenge to us all. It challenges us to confront the capacity for evil that exists within our own societies, within our own institutions, and even within ourselves. It challenges us to be vigilant, to speak out against injustice, and to never, ever forget. The man is gone. The questions remain. And in that space between the fact of his death and the failure of his capture, we find the true, unsettling, and enduring power of his story. It is a story not of an ending, but of a perpetual beginning, a constant, necessary confrontation with the darkest corners of our past, in the hope of illuminating a better future. The end story echoes in the eyes. The story of Josef Mengele does not end with his unremarkable death on a Brazilian beach in 1979, nor with the forensic confirmation of his identity 6 years later. To end it, there would be to accept his final, pathetic victory, the victory of silence, of a life unlived in the shadow of his crimes. No, the true story of Mengele is a story that continues to unfold, not in the archives of war criminals or the legal briefs of failed extradition attempts, but in the eyes of those who survived him. It is a story carried in the DNA of their children, in the hushed tones of their testimony, and in the global consciousness that must now grapple with the uncomfortable legacy of his escape. He is gone, but his shadow remains, a long, dark echo that reverberates through time, forcing us to ask questions not just about the past, but about who we are today. Consider the eyes of Eva Moses Core in her later years. They are not the eyes of a woman defeated. They are clear, direct, and piercingly intelligent. They have seen the absolute worst of humanity, the depths to which so-called civilized man can sink. Mengele's legacy is a warning that the greatest atrocities are not committed by monsters, but by ordinary people who have convinced themselves that they are doing the right thing. They ensured that Mengele's name would be forever synonymous with evil, and that his victims would be forever remembered. In the struggle to understand his escape, we learn more about ourselves, our values, and the fragile, precious nature of the humanity we must strive to protect. weight of these unanswered questions is not a curse. It is a responsibility. The end story. The anger, the raw, seething hatred that fueled her for decades is still there, but it is no longer in control. It has been transformed, transmuted into a force for good. She has looked at the ghost of her tormentor and decided she will not give him the satisfaction of her eternal hatred. Her eyes, once a mirror reflecting his cold, analytical gaze, now project a different kind of light, the light of hard-won wisdom, of a survivor who has reclaimed her own narrative. In her eyes, we see the final, ultimate defeat of Josef Mengele. He sought to reduce her to a number, to a specimen, to a collection of data points, but she became a teacher, a leader, a symbol of hope. He wanted to destroy her humanity. Instead, she used her humanity to illuminate the world. The echo of his evil in her eyes is not one of fear, but of triumph. Now consider the eyes of history. How does history look upon Josef Mengele? It sees him as a singular embodiment of Nazi depravity, a man whose name has become synonymous with medical torture and unethical experimentation. He is a cautionary tale, a benchmark for evil against which other atrocities are measured. But history also sees the context that allowed him to thrive. It sees the pseudoscientific racial theories of the time, the eugenics movement that had adherents in many countries, including the United States, long before the Nazis came to power. It sees the way a highly educated, cultured society like Germany could pervert its own intellectual and moral foundations to justify genocide. Mengele was not a madman working in a vacuum. He was a product of a system, a logical, if horrifying, extension of an ideology that believed some human lives were worthless and others were a threat to be eliminated. When history looks at Mengele, it is not just looking at one man. It is looking at the potential for darkness that exists within scientific inquiry when it is divorced from ethics and empathy. It is a warning that rings with terrifying clarity in our own age of rapid genetic advancement and artificial intelligence. The echo of Mengele in the eyes of history is a question. How do we prevent the monsters of the future from being born in the laboratories of today? And then there are the eyes of the world, the collective gaze of humanity, as it confronts the legacy of Mengele's escape. For a long time, the world looked away. After the war, there was a desire to rebuild, to move forward, to forget the horrors of the recent past. The Cold War created new priorities, and many former Nazis found themselves useful to the West in the fight against communism. Networks like Odessa operated not in complete secrecy, but in the gray areas of geopolitical expediency. The world's eyes were averted, and in that aversion, Mengele found his sanctuary. But the survivors would not let the world forget. Men like Simon Wiesenthal became the world's conscience, forcing it to look, to see what it would rather ignore. The testimonies of survivors like Eva, the slow, painstaking accumulation of evidence, the public pressure that kept the case alive for decades, all of these forced the world to look Mengele in the face, even if only in news reports and historical documentaries. The world was forced to confront its own complicity, its own failures of will and morality. The echo of Mengele in the eyes of the world is a challenge. It is a challenge to our commitment to justice, a challenge to our willingness to confront evil wherever it exists, even when it is inconvenient or uncomfortable. It asks us, are we truly dedicated to never again? Or is that just a hollow phrase we repeat while we look away from the injustices in our own time? The central motif, the symbol that haunts this entire narrative, is Mengele's eye. The cold, analytical, utterly detached eyes that selected victims on the ramp at Auschwitz, that observed their suffering with scientific curiosity, that saw children not as human beings, but as research material. Those eyes were the instrument of his evil, the window into a soul that had traded empathy for ideology. But over time, those eyes have become something more. They have become a mirror. They reflect back to us the capacity for cruelty that exists within us all. They force us to question our own capacity for indifference, for turning a blind eye to the suffering of others. When we look at photographs of Mengele, we are drawn to his eyes, and in them we see a void. But that void is not just his. It is a void that exists wherever humanity is denied. It is the void in the eyes of the torturer, the tyrant, the bigot. It is the void that allows ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. The survivors, in their own way, have taken control of this symbol. Eva Kor often speaks of Mengele's eyes, but she does so to reclaim the power they held over her. By describing them, by talking about the fear they instilled, she robs them of their mystery, their power. She turns them from a symbol of terror into a symbol of resilience. She looked into those eyes and survived. She looked into those eyes and found the strength to forgive. She looked into those eyes and decided to live a life of purpose and meaning. In doing so, she has transformed the symbol. The eyes of Josef Mengele are no longer longer just a testament to evil. They are also a testament to the incredible strength of the human spirit to overcome. The legacy of Mengele is thus a dual legacy. It is a legacy of horror, a reminder of the depths of human depravity and the fragility of civilization. It is a story of a man who escaped justice and died a free man, a bitter pill that history must swallow. But it is also a legacy of hope. It is the legacy of the survivors who refused to be broken, who bore witness to the truth, who dedicated their lives to ensuring that such a horror would never be forgotten. It is the legacy of a man like Simon Wiesenthal, who turned his own suffering into a lifelong pursuit of justice. And it is the legacy of Eva Moses Core, who taught the world that the ultimate victory over evil is not just to punish it, but to heal from it, to forgive it, and to live so fully and so well that it is rendered powerless. Josef Mengele sought to create a legacy through his research. He wanted to contribute to the Aryan race, to be remembered as a great scientist. He failed utterly. His pseudoscientific ramblings are worthless, a footnote in the darkest chapter of human history. It is a legacy of caution, of memory, and of the unbreakable bond of human survival. He is a ghost, but he is a ghost we have chosen to keep alive, not out of morbid fascination, but out of a solemn duty to remember. We remember his victims. We remember their courage. We remember their pain. And in remembering, we honor them, and we arm ourselves against the return of the darkness he represented. The final echo of Josef Mengele is not in the grave in Brazil, nor in the dusty files of a war crimes commission. It is in the eyes of every person who learns his story and feels a pang of revulsion, a flicker of anger, and then a renewed commitment to compassion. It is in the eyes of a student studying the Holocaust, determined to understand how such a thing could happen. It is in the eyes of a doctor taking an oath to do no harm, mindful of how that oath can be broken. It is in the eyes of all of us when we are forced to look into the abyss and decide what kind of people we will be. The angel of death is gone, but his gaze remains, a permanent fixture in our collective consciousness, challenging us, haunting us, and ultimately compelling us to be better. T.I. Letter 1E BFP, T. Letter 1E 5C Section, Conclusion Epilogue. The weight of unanswered questions. The story of Josef Mengele is not a closed book. It is an open wound, a historical lesion that refuses to fully scar over. We have followed his path from the manicured gardens of privilege to the barbed wire of Auschwitz, from the chaos of post-war Europe to the sun-drenched shores of South America. We have traced the decades-long hunt, the near misses, the systemic failures that allowed him to slip through the fingers of justice time and again. And we have confronted the bitter, anticlimactic reality of his death, a quiet, anonymous end, far from the reckoning he deserved. But to conclude his story here is to miss the point entirely. The true significance of Mengele's life and escape lies not in the biographical details, but in the profound and unsettling questions it forces us to confront about the nature of evil, the fragility of justice, and the responsibilities of memory. The most glaring question is one of justice itself. What does it mean when a perpetrator of such monumental evil is never held accountable? Mengele's case stands as a stark, brutal counter-narrative to the comforting belief that good will always triumph and that justice will ultimately be served. His freedom for 34 years after the war, his peaceful death, and his burial under a false name represent a catastrophic failure of the international community. It is a failure that began with the Allies' inability to catch him in the chaos of 1945, continued with the apathy and complicity that allowed him to build a new life in Argentina, and was compounded by the geopolitical realities of the Cold War that made his extradition a low priority. This failure is not merely a historical footnote. It is a crack in the foundation of our moral universe.